If I was to tell you that this play was somewhere between Gypsy, the musical Gypsy, and August Osage County, what would you make of that? Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Joe and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I am a professional theatre critic here on social media, and this is my theatre-themed YouTube channel where I review the shows that I have been invited to see. And this evening, I was invited to go and see the brand new West End play, The Hills of California, which has just opened at London's Harold Pinter Theatre. And if you've been around here for a while, then this is actually how I used to film my reviews, like after getting back on the night of seeing the shows, because I had a day job to go and do the next day. Ordinarily at the moment I tend to wait until the next day. I like to kind of sit with my thoughts about something for a bit, especially with a play like this. But on this particular evening I find myself so intrigued and fired up about it that I wanted to bring that energy here to you. So today I'm going to be letting you know what I thought about The Hills of California. I feel like it's a little bit enigmatic from the marketing material, so I'm also going to be letting you know what this play is about. If there are any spoilers in this review, I will do my best to flag them ahead of time, because if you know a Jez Butterworth play, we're going to be dealing with some revelations. If you know nothing about this, then this is the latest play from playwright Jez Butterworth, who is best known for his celebrated award-winning plays Jerusalem and The Ferryman, and this production has been directed by Sam Mendes, Academy Award-winning director, Tony Award-winning director, Olivier Award-winning director. He is very much a big deal. So prior to even opening, a play like this has a huge amount of expectation going in, and critics here and the London theatre scene in general are still hugely enamoured with Jerusalem. When the production was remounted not too long ago, there were a lot of think pieces about whether or not it was the best British play of the last century, which is a level of almighty adoration to which inevitably nothing else can compare. However, I'm going to be letting you know what I thought about this. So if you enjoyed today's review, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. There will be more reviews coming very soon of both plays and musicals, West End and Broadway. Finally, I love nothing more, especially when it comes to plays, than to hear other people's opinions. So if you have already seen The Hills of California, let me know what you thought about it in the comments section down below. But for now, let's talk about it. So as we arrive into the auditorium, we see this multi-level set designed by Rob Howell. There's this slightly puzzling tiki bar downstairs with various chairs and tables. Someone is attempting to tune a piano behind a serving hatch, and there are just many wooden staircases and many doors on the upper levels. Because we come to find out that this is a hotel, or it used to be a hotel, that has had many different names in its lifetime and has an awful lot of history, because it has also served as the home of the family around which our story is centred. The first person we meet is Jill, who is carrying a crib full of mementos down from the attic and anxiously trying to sneak a cigarette before having a conversation with the nurse who is caring for her ailing mother. We soon find out, as she does, that such is the nature of her mother's health that conversations are being had around palliative care and ways in which her suffering can be reduced or even ended. Also, her wider family has been summoned to the home after having moved away. She is one of 4 sisters. In fact, one has already arrived. We meet the stylish Ruby, who has no idea where her husband is ended up, and then pretty soon, like a whirlwind, we meet Gloria and her family. Gloria is the oldest of the 3 of them, but second oldest of the 4, including the one who is not currently in attendance because we find out she lives in America. This does nothing to alter the way in which Gloria behaves as the most dominant sibling. And as you would expect at such a time, difficult conversations are had, and we begin to learn small tidbits about their childhood, at which point we flash back to actually getting to see their childhood. The play takes place in 2 time periods just over 2 decades apart. And just as we're beginning to feel like we might be missing some important context for their relationships, we travel back to the past, where we see their mother, Veronica, a single mother and a hugely commanding presence who is at the same time trying to wrangle some unruly hotel guests as she's managing this business, and also organise her daughters in rehearsing for this Andrews Sisters-inspired act that they have. They are all children at this point. The oldest, Joan, is 15 and beginning to get a little bit rebellious. But not unlike Gypsy's Mama Rose, Veronica is a hugely committed stage mother who considers nothing more important than convincing these girls that they are going to be huge stars, but they are going to have to work for it. She is checking harmonies, enforcing rules, and doing this Socratic method of teaching about music, history, all with this sort of militaristic precision. Now, if you're wondering where the tension comes into all of this, aside from the whole imminent death thing, in the past, we are anticipating this big opportunity that the girls are going to have to audition that is going to change all of their fates. Obviously, there is a sense of us knowing where they all end up in the future, and then back in the future, or the present day, which is still in the past from when we are now. There is this Waiting for Godot-esque anticipation of the fourth sibling, Joan, and whether or not she will even deign to arrive. The puzzle pieces that make up the motivations behind her decision to go and visit her dying mother are yet to come in future flashbacks. And that essentially is the overview of the first of 3 acts. There is a 15-minute interval between acts 1 and 2. By the time we reached that interval, it felt as though we'd really barely gotten into the thing, and it certainly didn't feel like as much time had passed as it had. The pause between the second and third acts, however, is very brief. It's only about 5 minutes, and they don't actually recommend that you leave your seat. Having recently seen a 3-act play on Broadway, Prayer for the French Republic, I do think that that had a slightly better structure in having 2 equal length intermissions of 10 minutes each. I feel like that felt like the whole thing moved faster and didn't take quite as long as what ended up feeling like a very long second half after that initial interval. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of the synopsis of this play. It is set in Blackpool, and there are many references to the area. You can hear noises from outside. There are so many nods to its very specific and particular local seaside culture interwoven into the script. The funfair rides, the trams, the promenade, the dance halls, the bingo. This being a Jez Butterworth play, there are also scenes where it feels like there are 100 people on stage. We are going for this very realistic, naturalistic sort of a vibe. And so there are various hotel guests in the past and extended family members in the present who you will only meet very briefly. All of which serves to make the whole thing feel a little bit more real and less like a constructed play. As the themes of the scenes in the past may have suggested, we also get some musical performances. These are choreographed by the brilliant Ellen Kane, with musical supervision and arrangements by Candida Caldecott. But I am sure you're wondering what I actually thought of this play, so let me tell you first of all about the writing. If you've seen either of the Jez Butterworth plays that I've mentioned before, you may recall this sort of sense of not a lot happening for a long time. He's very good at defining character and atmosphere and environment and relationships. Who these people are and where they are and the nature of what this family is fleshed out with such thoroughness. It's a world that you can really live in and enjoy living in. The dialogue moves and flows with a realistic conversational familiarity. You don't feel the drive of these characters to try and get to the point because the playwright is heavy-handedly trying to articulate something. It is all very real and very genuine, sometimes frustratingly so. But like in those other plays, after a little while, we get these big revelations that change our understanding of what it is that we are looking at. And suddenly what it is that you thought this play was just becomes a component of a slightly different story. The main takeaway of which I think is the relationship between these 4 sisters. The first parallel that we get is seeing how differently they interact in the past versus when we move forwards to the present. We meet them slightly estranged with these pronounced tensions and resentments, and then we see them in the past, in childhood, and there is no sense of argument. They are hugely friendly towards each other. They are a well-practiced singing and dancing group, but we quickly realise why, and it's because of the absence of this missing piece, their eldest sister Joan. We see her in the past, and we see how each of them idolizes her in some way, because she's the oldest and because by 15 this has afforded her a certain worldliness, despite their mother insisting that no hotel guests are allowed to smoke even near an open window. Joan is brazenly lying down in the kitchen and smoking in front of her younger sisters, who are awestruck. Within what again feel like very realistic everyday conversations, she offers support and encouragement and reassurance to each of them, which makes it very easy for us to see why they are so fragmented and each of them broken in their own little way when we return to the present. What's also so interesting is the way in which the characterizations of these siblings changes and adapts depending on who they are around. When we first see Ruby speaking with Gillian, she is sort of authoritative and she's telling her what to do, and then when Gloria enters and Ruby is no longer the oldest in the room, Ruby becomes a little bit more joking. There's a lot of sort of dry and dark comedy in the earlier acts of this play that then gives way to just darkness. And I think a lot of the success of this play comes from this really smart choice of a setting, this inherently quite theatrical and emotional setting that is both repressed and triggers all of these kind of outbursts of emotion. The idea of returning to a childhood home filled with difficult memories and essentially waiting for the only parent figure that you've known to die, and that being the thing that reconnects you to siblings who you are emotionally distant from and having to confront realities in your own life. It's a fascinating dynamic to watch on stage, and what is done well both in the writing and by brilliant director Sam Mendes is we spend so much of this time posing questions that are then addressed and answered in the flashbacks to the past. They then provide the subsequent context retroactively to the relationships that we've already been introduced to, with each of those then prompting additional questions that will be resolved later. And it quickly enough all comes to be about the eldest sibling, Joan, and whether or not she is going to make an appearance. Now, before I go any further in this review, the rest of this is going to contain spoilers about the play because there is so much I need to be able to say about the performances and about the writing that I'm not going to be able to talk about if I don't mention certain spoilers. So if you don't want spoilers for this, then go and see the show and come back to me. But for those of you who are still here, let's talk about more of my thoughts about The Hills of California. So if I have a criticism about this, I do think the whole thing is a little long. I think this can happen with a lot of Jez Butterworth writing. It's about the vibes and it's about the reality, and it's all very conversational, and he is building atmosphere and he is building relationships, and that's not to say that it couldn't be trimmed down just a little bit. I don't know if it needs to be 3 acts long, honestly. I don't know if the conversation that Gillian has with the nurse at the beginning before either of her sisters arrive really needs to be as long as it is, but the most egregious, I think, is the scene that begins the 3rd act of the play in the present day, and this is going to build to quite an important revelation. So this scene takes place when Ruby's husband returns from one of his many unspecified walks and finds Gloria's husband attempting to fix the jukebox that Veronica, their mother, had installed in the hotel. They reminisce about the past and about their youth and about the men who they became, and soon enough this facilitates Gloria's husband telling us about Gloria's feelings about her older sister Joan. Now, the last thing that we've seen on stage was a scene from the past in which this important talent agent who represents Perry Como and who discovered Nat King Cole is visiting the hotel in order to audition the girls' act. He concludes that it's too similar to the Andrews sisters and out of step with what audiences nowadays, or whenever that was, are wanting, but suggests to an incredibly determined Veronica that he does glimpse star quality in one of the girls, the oldest, Joan. Throughout the play thus far, we have seen brilliant mirroring of the characters of Joan and her mother, Veronica. Gillian mentions offhand that Veronica had always said that Joan was the most like her, and we can see that exceptionally clearly in the first flashback scene. Anyway, cut forward to the big audition, and Veronica is a little reluctant to let Joan audition as a soloist, but she does. The conversation, however, begins to grow a little bit uncomfortable and takes a drastic turn into the hugely uncomfortable when this man announces that the acoustics in the kitchen just aren't suitable and asks if there's another room where he could hear her sing. Joan herself suggests Mississippi, which is the name of one of the bedrooms upstairs. Veronica is initially aghast at this, and and then wrestles with the decision of whether or not to allow this man to go upstairs with her 15-year-old daughter into a private room where she has every understanding of what is going to take place, as do we, the audience. And ultimately, unable to uproot years of determination and hard work, she says yes and allows the two of them to go upstairs. This was such a brilliantly crafted moment of tension in the theatre. It felt like a knife to the heart. So much was unspoken yet implicitly understood. And what I think is really interesting is the ambiguity of this moment, because Joan herself had made the suggestion. We will then wonder through the following scenes, and after leaving the theatre, how aware she was of the situation that was about to unfold, which is quite a different thing than Joan simply being entrapped in a situation engineered and agreed to entirely by her mother. Another smart writing choice. As soon as the two of them leave, another of the hotel guests, who is also her rehearsal pianist and friend Joe, comes into the room and asks what's happening and where Joan is, and she is so unable to face the reality of that and herself that she misdirects all of her rage towards him and fires him on the spot, after which we have this incredibly poignant scene where she is simply standing, staring out and hearing Joan singing this audition song, which then stops, which ends the second act. Now cut back to the third act, where the two husbands are bonding over their wives, and Gloria's husband is explaining what Gloria has told him about Joan, which is that at age 15 she became pregnant, had to have an abortion, and was basically shipped to the United States by her mother. Given the context of what we've just witnessed as an audience, this is pretty horrifying. The two men share a heart-to-heart, and then there's this slightly odd moment in which Ruby's husband begins to talk about having witnessed a woman on the pier, I believe, earlier that day, and saying he could have fallen down in shock, and then not revealing who it was, but it's as though he's building up to suggesting that he had seen Joan, which in a play that does a lot of very valuable foreshadowing is slightly pointless. And I think there is enough anticipation of the potential arrival of this character or not at this point in the play that we don't need a moment like that. And in fact, this entire exchange between the two men could be a lot shorter, or could be entirely excised from the script, because the only purpose that it ultimately serves is to share with us that Gloria has a perspective about what happened to Joan that is different from the one that we are going to take because we have just seen what happened. But like the human interpretation of Chekhov's gun, Joan has been mentioned too many times not to show up in this play. And just as Gloria's husband Bill believes that he hasn't successfully fixed the jukebox, it suddenly bursts into life, and as music begins to pour out of it, Joan enters her former home in the middle of the night, played by the same actress who played her mother in the past. This being the culmination of the comparison between the two characters. Gillian is the first to come downstairs and is thrilled to see Joan, and fairly quickly reveals to her that she had written to Joan and beseeched her to come and visit because recently, on her deathbed, their mother Veronica had explained to Gillian what had happened in the past. Now all of this has been brewing in the previous interactions with her other two sisters. Gillian has been looking for something since the beginning of the play. She was bringing things down from the attic because she's looking for an old photo of their mother Veronica holding Joan as a baby. A photo that she will end up using to try and convince Joan to go and speak to their mother before she dies and ultimately forgive her. But throughout all of this, it's clear that Gillian hasn't wanted to explain everything that she knows about this to her other two sisters, especially Gloria, who is still harbouring a great resentment and has her own skewed perspective on what happened that fateful night. Then somewhat frustratingly, when the other two sisters come down and see that Joan has actually arrived and the four of them are reunited for the first time in decades, Gillian tells Joan, and us the audience by extension, that she had filled the other two in and told them what had happened. This conversation having taken place off stage in between the beginning of the play and now. But it's at this moment that Gloria reveals her feelings about it, having listened in at the door when Joan was in the room alone with this talent agent. Gloria believing that Joan knew what she was doing and was selling out the other three in order to have her chance at fame. And this is why the scene between the two husbands and also Gloria's son, who comes down utterly needlessly, does feel superfluous to me, because we already find out what Gloria's perspective on it is. We don't need her husband to tell Ruby's husband that in order to tell us, the audience, that. More to the point, it would be more impactful if we heard that out of Gloria's mouth first. The other issue I have with this third act is that it does feel a little bit frustrating, because this reunion of the four has been so anticipated, and there's so much unspoken and so much to be resolved, and what's just happened to Joan is still so fresh emotionally to us as an audience, even though she's had 2 decades to process it, that this reunion cannot possibly provide everything that we need it to as an audience. It cannot possibly amount to what we want it to. And going for naturalism and going for realistic family angst, it ends up being filled with these trauma-infused exchanges and just frustrating miscommunications and unwillingness to really be emotionally forthcoming. You just want to shake everyone on stage, and Joan enters blasé and indifferent and reserved, and you want her to explain what happened to her, but we never really get a sense of it from her perspective. She confides to Gillian privately that Gloria's interpretation of it is just an interpretation, but that isn't really a rebuttal, nor do we really get her emotional response to it all. What we get instead is 2 distinct monologues from Joan, which she uses in order to answer questions. The first being what her life is actually like now, and whether she is a glamorous, wealthy singer in Los Angeles, and the second being why it is that she actually came to visit her sisters, which is the last big revelation in the play, and a spoiler I don't think I need to tell you about here, but it does draw one final heartbreaking parallel between her and her mother, and speaks to the impact of her mother's choices as a parent and how they have affected her as an adult. After all of this, the final moments of the play are so brilliantly directed by Sam Mendes. The 4 of them finally sing together again, and as Joan is standing up to leave, as the rest of them are still singing and sort of oblivious to the fact that she is stepping away, she then walks through to the other part of this rotating stage, by the way, because the whole thing is on a revolve, allowing us to move between the different locations, and she glimpses a memory of the 4 of them singing as girls, but she is still separated from the other 3. And it's a haunting visual, but the whole thing is an incredibly haunting play. And it explores the sometimes complex relationships that we have with our parents, as well as just how time changes people and how time changes things. They spend a lot of time talking about how the local area has changed and how there are shops that don't exist anymore. It's a play about memory, it's a play about regret, and if it invests a lot of its time in having very naturalistic conversations, it doesn't say as many things or cover as many topics as a hyper-intellectual play written by the likes of Tom Stoppard might be able to, but the conversations that it does have and the relationships that it does establish feel genuine and earned and authentic. Speaking of which, let me carry on telling you about this play by telling you about the performances. There are still going to be spoilers in this section, but I have to talk about the sublime dual turn from Laura Donnelly. We first meet her in the past playing Veronica, the girl's mother. The beauty of this writing being that we have learned so much about her, and we've developed so much intrigue about her character because of what we've been told about in the previous scene. She is anticipated by us with such curiosity, and she delivers on that promise with such panache and force. She commands an enormous authority. There's a brilliant moment where one of the hotel guests tries to enter the premises via the private family entrance, and she demands that he step back out and take a 10-minute detour in order to go around the correct way, and she won't let him go past out of principle. Everything in her world is obsessively focused on her girls and their act and their career and the Andrews sisters and how they're going to emulate that same success and drilling it into them. It turns into a complete tour de force when we get to see the other side of this coin, and she enters playing adult Joan, which is such an interesting concept to explore as an actor, playing not only the parent making that heartbreaking decision in real time, but then getting to play the child 20 years later, still dealing with the emotional impact of that and the aftermath and how that affects you as an adult and a potential parent. But her interpretation of adult Joan is also so fascinating. There is such nuance to it. She is worldly and cool, and she's chain smoking with like Charlie's Angel's hair. She's emotionally ambivalent and unfazed by her sister's histrionics and tells these fascinating, engaging stories about her now colourful life. In short, it's an incredible turn from Laura Donnelly. The next person I want to tell you about is Leanne Best, who plays Gloria. She doesn't benefit from the opportunity to play as much duality, but enters as just as much of a force in the first act. She is visibly angry that it's taken them so long to arrive on such a warm day and that they've had to travel so far. And we come to find out that all of this is tied up in her resentment of her older sister Joan that began when she overheard this conversation years ago, and she overheard Joan in the room with the man. Because you see, at this point, Gloria has made the effort to travel very far for hours in the car on a hot day, and Joan has yet to show up. What's interesting is the very subtle shift in her demeanour when she then confronts Joan, because the other younger siblings have a much more pronounced change of behaviour, which we're going to talk about momentarily. But for Gloria, she is still aggressive and she is still trying to assert dominance, and she's still trying to run everything because she doesn't want to relinquish the control. She doesn't feel as though she owes Joan that responsibility or that power, because where has Joan been this entire time? Plus, she's still of the belief that Joan betrayed them all as a child in order to gain wealth and success and stardom for herself. But there is this slight shift where Gloria's delivery becomes a little bit more petulant and a little bit more childish, because the rage that she's holding on to is a juvenile one. It's one that she's had since adolescence, and that's where that's coming from. Then we have Ophelia Lovibond, who plays Ruby, and she's marvellous in this show. She gets to do a host of very different things because she is this middle child whose behaviour adapts hugely depending on who she is in the room with. She gets some really funny moments, some really great dry jokes in the first two acts. There's a brilliant line she has after her husband leaves, and she remarks that if he were to go missing and the police would ask her how to identify him, that she would genuinely struggle. When asked about why she married him, she talks about the first boyfriend that she had and how she started at the top and then subsequently decided that any man she was with ought to feel like he was privileged to be with her, which is a hilarious monologue that ends with an unexpected moment of contemplation and regret, which is really interesting to see. Aside from anything else, Ophelia also has a beautiful voice in the moments we get to hear her sing. But it's her behaviour around Joan that changes completely. She turns completely back into a child. We see her regressing, first gleefully and talking too much and asking about America, and going from being the glamorous one of the three to fawning over her more glamorous sister Joan. In both the past and the present scenes, it's great to see each of the characters drawing on elements of Joan's personality that they kind of appropriate for themselves. Each of them have ways in which they try to take after their older sister. Ophelia as Ruby also has this moment where she has to portray a panic attack on stage, which is really interesting to watch. And she has some of the greatest capability to move and to shock us, because we've seen her being a really indifferent and sarcastic and comic presence. She so doesn't care when her husband goes missing for hours at a time, and she's so emotionally unattached to that when we see her distraught and having a panic attack, we are stunned by this. The quartet of sisters is completed by Helena Wilson as Jill, who does some wonderful, passionate, emotive work. I do think hers is the character that raises the most questions for me, because she, this entire time, while the other two have been building families and have married and have had children, she has just lived kind of like as a hermit in this home, taking care of her mother. She's never been able to leave, and it implies this sort of a Grey Gardens type of dynamic, except there is no indication she has any level of resentment. We hear Gloria's interpretation of why she stayed there, but we don't actually get to hear this really from Jill herself. That sort of feels like the speech and the outburst that is missing from the whole thing. And ultimately, I do feel as though also the conversation she has with the other two sisters where she lets them know what happened to Joan when she was 15 should have been portrayed on stage, and that would have been the opportunity for Jill to talk about her own life through that lens as well. And when Jill shares with Joan that she knows what happened to her, I do find it hard to rationalise the immense sympathy that she has for that hardship that Joan had to go through, and her very quick pivot to how important it is that Joan forgive their mother. There's also brilliant support throughout the cast. Brian Dick is fantastic as Ruby's husband Dennis, but also particularly as Jack Larkin in those scenes in the past, delivering all of these one-liners. He's trying to be a comedian. He's sort of an awkward presence. Richard Lumsden really lands this one wounding moment as Joe, the pianist, when he comes back into the kitchen and sees that Joan is missing and has gone upstairs, and he asks Veronica about it. And also Corey Johnson, who plays Luther St. John, the talent agent. We don't meet him outside of this one short scene, but he is so genuinely insidious and so disturbingly confident and self-assured in his machinations here that it's just terrifying. And critically, it manages to be both unforeseen and then very clearly understood. We don't anticipate it whatsoever, but we don't doubt it for a second when it arrives. All of the young performers who play the girls in Childhood are just fantastic, and the rapport between them is brilliant, both when they are, just doing dialogue and when they are performing. But Lara McDonnell, who plays young Joan, the symmetry that she manages to get with Laura Donnelly's performance as her mother, Veronica. She's the perfect amount of knowing and scheming that it raises questions but doesn't quite confirm them. A hugely talented young actress giving a very interesting performance. But those have been my thoughts on The Hills of California, currently playing at the Harold Pinter Theatre. Like I said, if you have been to see this play already, comment down below with what you thought of it. I'm so intrigued to hear what people took away from this. It's really rich material, especially in terms of character, that there are so many interesting inferences you could make here. But I hope that you've enjoyed my thoughts, and if you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. Like I said, many more reviews coming very soon. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!